here on that Saturday, November 16th. So more information about the exact time will be forthcoming, but I just wanted to lift that up a little bit early. And lastly, I'll just, if you're visiting for the first time, I'll just mention briefly that we are in the midst of a sermon series where the overall theme is bridging the cultural divide, realizing that we're living in very divisive times as we head into the election right around the corner now. And so we've been talking about civility and truth, and soon we're going to be transitioning in the topic of democracy. And so today on Pride Sunday, I'm trying to connect some dots and talk a little bit about gender as a lightning rod. You may notice there's a typo on the screen when we get to the sermon. It says lighting rod, but that kind of works too, right? We're trying to illuminate society and talk about what's really going on. You know, I'm basically curious, like, why are we so adversarial around issues of gender? And how can we talk about that in ways that are not so divisive and get to a deeper place in our understanding of these things? So that's where we're headed today with our Woman at the Well story. That'll ease us into the subject of gender, I think, in a fun, interesting way.
Body or spirit, join me for our call to worship on this Pride Sunday. This is our litany for identity. Creator God, you formed us. In you we live and move.
And have our being.
We acknowledge that many voices try to tell us who we are.
Who we are not.
Many voices tell us our value is based upon appearance, achievement,
Social status, gender, ethnicity, talent.
and many would have us believe that our doing is more important than our being.
We renounce these voices.
We are your children, the work of your hands.
Unique and beloved by you,
May we become more awake to your love.
which has no limits, your love which defines us, your love which begins us and completes us.
May we walk in the sureness of our identity.
In the confidence of your love,
May all we do come from the core of who we are.
love and made of love.
Amen.
If you'd all be seated. And we're going to do a song response now. And I'm going to teach you. I'm going to sing something and you're going to repeat it. So if I go, you can go on to the next slide. If I go, you will draw water joyfully. You will draw from the springs of salvation. Very good. Now you've got to sing it much stronger than that, though, when we do it. All right, here we go. You will draw water joyfully from the springs of salvation. God indeed is my Savior. I am confident and unafraid. My strength and my courage is the Lord. Let us draw water with joy. You will draw water joyfully from the springs of salvation. God, give thanks to the Lord, all you people. All the nations on earth sing praise. Proclaim the wonder of all God's deeds. How wonderful is God's name. You will draw water joyfully from the springs of salvation. Sing praise to the Lord, all you people. Let the song be heard o'er the earth. Shout in your joy, O city of Zion. Come and behold the Lord your God. You will from the springs of salvation.
Our reading today comes from the Gospel of John. And this is the story of Jesus talking with the Samaritan woman. Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John. Although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria, so he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. And Jacob's well was there. And Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon, when a Samaritan woman came to draw water. And Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?"
You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?
If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given living water.
Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?
Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the eternal life.
Sir, give me this water. Draw water.
He told her, "Go, call your husband and come back." You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true.
Sir, I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem.
Woman, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know. For salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and is now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth. For they are a kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth.
I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us.
I, the one speaking to you, I am he. Here ends the reading.
I wanted to begin by wishing everyone a happy Pride Sunday. It's always been a big deal at Desert Palm, and when I pulled in about 7 this morning, Sonia was heading off to the parade, and Pat Quinnett had already left with a group. So, you know, our young folks especially love participating in that. So, and it lends itself here, of course, today as we're talking about the political divide, LGBT community, gender, sexual orientation. These things are obviously lightning rods in this current time. So it's needless to say, it is a potentially and just plain old divisive topic. not here per se, right? Because we've been open and affirming forever, and there's some powerful stories about that early process of our church becoming open and affirming, and many things we could lift up by way of celebrating our identity in that regard. I think it's Maureen's inscripted brick out there that says, I love my gay sons. So that always makes me happy, whenever I see that one. There's a story Cindy Carver likes to tell of her dad, who I guess was a bit traditional, of a different generation, and how he used to come to church and ended up gradually, we tend to sit in the same seats over and over, and I guess he tended to sit in a seat, and next to him was a woman who was trans. And that was a new experience for Cindy's dad, but as time went on, they became friends. And Cindy, her dad's long since passed away, but it's just really noteworthy how often she brings up that story, because I think to her it said something profound about who we are. We say we welcome everyone. I think most faith communities aspire to be radically inclusive, but and we do too, and so that's an example of getting it right. I also looked at that story about Cindy's dad and a new friendship, because one of the ways we're trying to bridge the cultural divide is by just talking about our common humanity, right? We can get wrapped up in our differences, and we can fight, and we can get mad or afraid or be reluctant to say anything out in public because, it could be taken the wrong way, or, we don't know who we're going to offend. But the idea is that there is a basic common humanity. Catalina and I went on a motorcycle ride yesterday morning. We're all excited, got up early, before sunrise, everything ready. Started heading off to the Superstitions, and there was a light rain as we left. And Catalina was like, "No, it is impossible, it's not going to rain." And sure enough, it just rained harder and harder. And so I pulled into some little random cafe, and I just had a feeling it was going to be a more conservative crowd. And it was. But it was just so interesting walking in there. And then it just kind of, you can't make this up. Catalina had this scarf on her head because her helmet was kind of tight and irritating her forehead. And when she took her helmet off, I hadn't noticed this before, but in this context I did. She totally looked like a Muslim. And so we come walking in, and there was such a warm welcome, to this place. And some guys were teasing me, nice day for a motorcycle ride, huh? And we're laughing, and it was just humanity, people out for breakfast on a Saturday morning. So I think we need some reminders right about now that, we're ultimately, we are all just human beings trying to figure out what is right, what is good, what is beautiful, how can we live our lives in meaningful ways. And yet this question remains, why is gender such a lightning rod? And I had, one of my long spiels here about how we have evolved, and how Christianity in general has been slow to recognize our embodied existence, and we tend to want to have a pie-in-the-sky spirituality where we don't have to worry about our bodies or sexuality or gender. But I think that's obvious, and we've covered that ground, by now, so we can just invoke that, okay? I do want to say I think it's important to recognize that as a species, we're in the early stages of making sense out of all this stuff. Our bodies, how we got here, evolution, gender, how we relate, to the rest of life on the planet. What indigenous folks call the four-legged creatures, what ecologists call the more than human web of life that we're surrounded by. So we're just starting out to figure this out. So I think we can try to bring some humility. We can try to bring some honesty and just say, okay, you know what, this is a difficult subject, and it's vast and overwhelming. And I certainly won't be able to exhaust it in my 5 or 10 minutes here, but we can recognize that we're at the beginning of an important conversation about sexuality, about gender, and the church, especially on the progressive religious left, is embracing the discoveries of science, and there are new and exciting and broader ways of approaching these issues. We can recognize that there is an ancient, cosmic, planetary dance between masculine and feminine energies. It's ancient and profound, and it runs through us all. So I don't think it's just a coincidence that gender and sexuality and sexual orientation are such a lightning rod. So again, in our effort to see past the divide, we want to say, hey, there's a common humanity, right? We're not as different as we sometimes think. And I think this also pertains to the broad subject of gender. It also illuminates things like race and class and expressions of faith. These things are deeply woven together. On the surface, of course, we can point to all kinds of differences, right? But beneath the dance of identity politics is a desire on the part of everyday people to come to terms with the reality of what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be gender fluid? It depends on where you are, how you identify. Sexuality, gender, these are huge pieces of human existence, and yes, they can make us a little nervous. I mean, I like to joke, and I'm of course not really joking, that as a Protestant minister, I'm kind of especially terrified of talking about these things. I usually try to pretend I don't have a body, right? So that to embrace our embodied existence is it's still something that we're trying to figure out how to do, right? But we want to go deep, and we don't want to just kind of stay at the surface, right? And just kind of giggle about our discomforts, right? About these things. I mentioned that book, Strong Men, a while back. The author was interviewed at the ASU Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. It's a book about demagogues and dictators. There's an interesting section in that book. Bob Bloffen actually went out and got the book and read it. I was so impressed, I couldn't believe it. There's a section in that book where this is a book about strong men, about dictators, and patterns of behavior. And one of the things I found so fascinating in that book was that it talks about how dictators will leverage homophobia and fear of anything that's taking place outside the clearly rigidified, codified kind of, acceptable social blinders, right? And the reason they do that is because oftentimes as men, though, she has a whole little long footnote about when there's a woman dictator, this applies, but it's basically taking the power structure of a given society and leveraging it to harm people. And so if there's a little homophobia, if there's a little kind of, slander or stigma about the people that are outside these acceptable margins, when a dictator comes to power, that is intensified. It's no coincidence that along with the Jews, gay people were put in the Nazi gas chambers. This gender stuff runs deep as we're willing and able to go. And it's not just the fact that gay people on this Pride Sunday, recognizing that the gay community was rounded up by the Nazis and executed. There's more to it than that. Men, and I'm quoting now, men during the Nazi reign of power who did not meet the ideal of soldierly masculinity were treated with hormones to enhance their virility. Okay? Nazi campaign. The Nazis even set up brothels for slave laborers and concentration camp inmates in the hopes of exacting more labor with the promise of sexual rewards. Gender, concentration camps, Nazis, woven together, so fascinating. If you're curious as to how all this plays out in the religious world today, the religious, political, cultural world, I'd point you to a couple of different places. Walter Wink wrote a classic kind of superb little volume on homosexuality from a Christian perspective. Walter was a biblical scholar who taught at Union and then was affiliated with Auburn. He wrote a trilogy of books on power, a very well-respected biblical scholar. And so he wrote a little book, a little treatise on homosexuality as a New Testament scholar. And basically the takeaway from that book is if you really take the time to look at the New Testament teachings on homosexuality, what you find is, and also reaching back to the Hebrew Bible, what you find are some important lessons about power and the abuses of power. And suddenly we're back at the suppression of all things feminine. And anyone who defies traditional boundaries becomes suspect, right? We would be remiss if we were to talk about things without also just briefly touching on how this gender and sexuality stuff plays out in relation to racism. Any history of racism, I mean, if you read Stamped from the beginning, there's 1,000 good books out there right now that will give you a good overview of the history of racism in this country. All of them will have somewhere, will touch on the sexualization of the black body. That's one way, we white mainstream Christians have dealt with the difficulties around sexuality in the body. We'll just say, well, this is not us, that's them over there, and we just project it on to people of color. A bunch of us a while back read that book, Black Like Me, about the white journalist who colored himself black, took a bunch of tanning pills, shaved his head. He just looked like a bald black guy. And he went across the country on a Greyhound bus and did some hitchhiking too. And there's a little anecdote in that book where he gets picked up by a white guy. He's hitchhiking, white guy picks him up, and right away starts, kind of probing him for stories around sexuality. Tell me something lusty, tell me something fun. And it's just a blatant example of sexualizing black bodies, black people. Needless to say, that is the tip of the iceberg. And I'm not just talking about, Thomas Jefferson's kids with Sally Heming, right? I mean, that's part of the iceberg, yes, but more broadly, we're talking about the flow of power in the world. And if we step back and we just, think about slavery, centuries of slavery, we're talking in part about women in cages, literally in chains, and the mostly white men who had complete power over their bodies. Gender, sexuality, and power. We have to introduce that power piece if we really want to try to figure out what is going on here. This speaks to the women's movement in general, which famously began, the first wave feminism was mostly white women struggling for rights and a voice, and then they're corrected by women of color who say, hey, we're oppressed in all the ways you are, and then in all these other ways. So you get these waves of feminist thought. But lest we get lost in the details, the major thrust of all of the waves of feminism have been an attempt at liberation from patriarchy, the exploitation of women, and the valuing of men over women. I don't know if anybody's heard of Andrea Dworkin, but she's one of the most powerful feminist writers I've ever encountered, and I want to quote to you something that she has to say on the subject of inferiority, just to give you a feeling for her writing, which I highly recommend. It's difficult. She's difficult to read, especially for me as a straight white guy. I oftentimes feel, what's the word, convicted by much of what, we don't use that word much anymore, but any straight man here, I challenge you to read Andrea Dworkin and not feel convicted, or maybe it's just me. This is what she has to say about inferiority. It is not a petty affliction like a bad skin or circle under the eyes. It is not a superficial flaw in an otherwise perfect picture. It is not a point of view that that some people with soft skins find offensive. No, this idea of inferiority is the deep and destructive devaluing of a person in life, a shredding of dignity. Shredding. Imagine to have your dignity shredded. Wow. It is a shredding of dignity and self-respect, an imposed exile from human worth and human recognition. You can't be worthy, you can't be recognized because you are exiled. When we decide this group is inferior, we are exiling them from the human race. It is the forced alienation of a person from even the possibility of wholeness or internal integrity. Inferiority puts rightful self-love beyond reach. How sad is that? That when we brainwash people into thinking that they are inferior, the concept that they could love themselves is beyond reach. I don't believe that, but it's strongly worded, and I like Dworkin. Inferiority is a dream fragmented by insult into a perpetually recurring nightmare. You can see, she is hard to read. Hard on your heart and soul. But if we're going to honestly engage our gospel reading today, remember that story that Susan and Michael did? The woman at the well? What do we have there? We have a man and a woman. We have gender. We have a flow of power. Let's think about that for a second. Jesus as a man speaking to a woman who is outside his circle of friends. Oh, you're not UCC, or you're not Baptist, or you're not Presbyterian, I can't talk to you, or you're not Democrat, or you're not Republican, right? I mean, we have all our different ways that keep us in our group. 2,000 years ago, Jesus is dealing with the same thing. But it's noteworthy that he goes outside his group, right? He's tired, he's thirsty, and he's Jesus, right? So he's social boundaries are not going to totally hold him back. The woman in the story makes it explicit. You're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? And then there's this editorial gloss for the Jews do not associate with Samaritans. It's a flash bulb moment that we can see in light of all these things that we're talking about in terms of gender, power, oppression of women and sexual minorities, right? Anybody who is outside the male-dominant patriarchal system of power, that, yes, Jesus was in it. I don't think it's clear from this story that Jesus has stepped completely away from patriarchy. I mean, had he been following all the rules, he would not have talked to this woman at all, right? So, I mean, he is kind of shaking things up. He's talking to her, right? And of course, this is a story written by other men about, something that may have happened to Jesus. But however we account for it, there still is a huge power imbalance here. Jesus, as the man, as the hero of the story and this unnamed woman. It's always interesting when you get somebody's name or you don't get their name, right? You know, if you're important, your name is mentioned, right? And then that's intensified by this uncomfortable sense of judgment coming from Jesus. Michael came up to me before the service and says, hey, I just got to ask you, you know, what's the point in Jesus saying to this woman, yeah, well, he's not your husband, and actually you've had 4 husbands, and the one you're with is not your husband. And I was like, Michael, this is what my sermon is about. He tells her to go get her husband. She says she doesn't have a husband. And there's this uncomfortable moment as we sit there listening to the story where Jesus seems to be judging her. You're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you've had 5, and the man you're with now is not your husband. So within this story about the water of life, about the healing, and, you know, take a sip of this water, you'll never be thirsty forever. In the midst of this beautiful story, there is this power play with Jesus kind of pushing this woman down. Now, of course, it fits with the attitude of the times. Needless to say, it kind of still would work in our time, right? You know, I mean, there's clearly it's still kind of a, you know, a macho attitude. It wouldn't be surprising if we read this in a novel or a book and just be like, okay, yeah, you know, that's typical. So what we're talking about is the power structure, the way society's been put together, and the way power flows through that society to keep people in their places, right? Right? Now, it's not to say there's nothing of value in this story, but it is to say we have to be aware that when we see limitations within our own tradition, we have to use the canon within the canon to critique that. I mean, when we read that slaves should be submissive to their masters, we don't just say, okay, yay, slavery, right? We say, no, the general thrust of the Bible is about liberation. So we have to interpret that with the weight of the entire biblical revelation. And I think that's what we have to do here. It reminds us of that other story that we had a couple weeks ago where another unnamed woman says to Jesus, can you heal my daughter? And he says, hey, you're not part of my group. And she says, even the dogs beneath the table deserve some crumbs. And so he has mercy on her. So again, I think there's this tension that we see emerging within the Bible about Jesus, let's say his human side, his male side, right? He's at times feeling like he should stay within the rules, and it's women who help him see a larger reality. In today's gospel reading, we have another nameless woman, the so-called woman at the well. And yet the story informs us that they're at the Jacob's well. So we don't get her name, but we get the name of the man that the well is named after, the man who lived centuries before. Patriarchy, men, power. It's all there if we have eyes to see and ears to hear. And yet I would argue that it's noteworthy that Jesus does step beyond the boundaries of his own tradition by talking to her in the first place. And it's interesting, if you look at the story carefully, when the disciples come back and they find Jesus talking to this woman, they're a little taken back, right? And the thing that's even more interesting, if you go back and you read this closely, when the text says, when the disciples got back and they saw Jesus talking to this woman, they thought, well, that's strange. But they didn't say anything. They didn't ask, why were you talking to that woman? There was discomfort there. Same discomfort that we have now around gender. This is the reason gender is a lightning rod, because it puts us in touch with powerful forces in the universe. This is the way these sorts of invisible chains operate. We don't identify them. We don't speak about them. We don't talk about the number of phone calls the domestic violence line gets in Tempe, right? We don't talk about those things. I want to quote that part of the story. Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. but no one asked, why are you talking with her? The gospel narrative moves on with the woman running to get her friends and saying, hey, you have to come here, this prophet. But the silence of the disciples, I think, is worth sitting with for a second here. I can't shake the feeling that there is something important about this silence. If there is truly something in that well that can quench our thirst forever, then surely it has something to say about centuries of patriarchal abuse of women. And of course, on this LGBT Sunday, of the LGBT community. It has to have something to say about the celebration of the masculine at the expense of all things feminine. Not to mention the outright persecution of those on the margins, which we see evidence of every day and historically. As I was writing this, I wanted to bring it to a conclusion by saying, well, what's the common ground here? On the right, you have people who are holding to, what we often have referred to as traditional values. And I think there's something to that. In these changing times of great uncertainty, there's a desire for a firm foundation to be standing on, right? I think that's what folks on the right are looking for and wanting. On the liberal side, you have the view that things are changing in a good way, that society is becoming more sensitive, more aware, that through gender studies, we're widening our awareness of what's true. And so I think the challenge is to envision a firm foundation where we can integrate new information. It's getting hot in here. And I'm going to end with a quote, and I just want to lift this up as a resource. Leslie, if you can hit, I think I put the heater on first thing when it was cold in here. If you could just switch it to cold. This is another great book. I think some of the women in the women's big study read a book by Nadia Bolz-Weber. She's a Protestant minister. This one is called Shameless, A Sexual Reformation. And she talks about the history of sexuality and modern attitudes about it. And she mentioned something in this book called the Nashville Statement, and I'm not bashing Tennessee. That's where my ancestors on my mom's side are from. But apparently the Nashville Statement is some hyper-conservative statement about how we're living in changing times, so here's the truth on gender, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so she felt like, you know what, we should broaden this. We should rewrite this in a way that makes sense for folks who are open to social and cultural change and evolution around our ideas. And so this is the statement they came up with, and I wanted to close with this. She writes, Christians at the dawn of the 21st century find themselves living in an exciting, beautiful, liberating, and holy period of historic transition. Western culture has embarked upon a massive revision of what it means to be a human being by expanding the limits and definitions previously imposed on us, yes, by the church. By and large, the spirit of our age discerns and delights in the beauty of God's design for human life that is so much richer and so much more diverse than we have previously understood it to be. So I wanted to close with that quote because she's capturing something that we can look at this time of radical transition as something terrifying and something that makes us want to hold on to whatever messages we got pertaining to family and gender roles and that sort of things, misguided though they may be. You know, and she's saying it's possible to take this time of transformation and to say, this is a time of expanded freedom where we can see and appreciate each other in new ways, where we can let our light shine and our voices be heard. We can create faith communities where everyone is welcome at the table. May it be.
God, who sees behind appearances to the heart, we know that one of the biggest obstacles we face in living out your kingdom is our own self-interest. We know that we must learn to regard money as a tool and not a prize. Yours is an altogether different economy in which mercy is valued over judgment. Care for the least is valued over self-promotion. Meekness is valued over popularity. Generosity is valued over accumulation. And spiritual riches are valued over financial wealth. So help us to understand your values and live in light of them. Help us to be faithful in the smallest responsibilities. Acts of kindness, gifts given generously, words spoken gently, finances stewarded faithfully, and peace offered freely, so that when our destinies arise before us, we are ready to meet them.
I'm really thankful that Desert Palm is an oasis and a sanctuary for all people. And I want to say thank you for that. A new statistic came out, only 52% of churches accept the LGBTQ community in some form and fashion. So that means there's still 48% that totally reject them. And but what a wonderful place that anybody can come here and be found. Have you ever felt like nobody was there? Have you ever felt forgotten in the middle of nowhere? Have you ever felt like you could disappear, like you could fall and no one would hear? Well, let that lonely feeling wash away, 'cause maybe there's a reason to believe you'll be okay. 'Cause when you don't feel strong enough to stand, you can reach out your hand. And oh, someone will come running, and I know they'll take you home. Even when the dark comes crashing through, when you need a friend to carry you, and when you're broken on the ground, you will be found. So let the sun come streaming in, 'cause you'll reach up and you'll rise again. Lift your head and look around. You will be found. 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 place that we don't have to feel unknown. And every time that you call out, you're a little less alone. If you only say the word, from across the silence, your voice is heard. Oh, someone will come running. Oh, to take you home. Someone will come running to take you home. Even when the dark comes crashing through, when you need a friend to carry you, when you're broken on the ground, you will be found. So let the sun come streaming in, and you reach up and you rise again. If you only look around, you will be found. You will be found. You will be found. Out of the shadows, the morning is breaking, and all is new. All is new. It's filling up the empty, and suddenly I see that all is new. All is new. You're not alone. You are 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 not alone. Even when the dark comes crashing through, when you need someone to carry you, when you're broken on the ground, you will be found. So let the sun come streaming in, 'cause you'll reach up and you'll rise again. If you only look around, you will be found. Even when the dark comes crashing through, you will be found. When you need someone to carry you, you will be found. You will be found. Give thanks with a grateful heart. Give thanks to the Holy One. Give thanks because God's given so much love for us. And now let the weak say, I am strong. The poor say, I am rich because of what our God has done for us. Give thanks.
Standing as you are able in body or spirit, and join me now for our offertory prayer, an invitation to gratitude. Gracious and loving God of many names, we praise you for creating LGBTIQ people and those who love us. We honor those who have been working for change as people of faith inside and outside of religious structures. Let us thank those among us who have struggled and have emerged on the other side, and those who continue to struggle. Let us thank those agitators and prophets among us who don't take party lines and who speak truth to power even when it is dangerous or when no one seems to be listening. Let us thank those advocates among us who bring a moral voice to the world and speak boldly and courageously for themselves and for all of us. Thank the peacemakers and reconcilers among us who draw us together and help share the beauty of all people. For building a world where all people are celebrated and loved. For celebrating sexual and gender diversity as a blessing that enriches us all. For working to overcome cruelty and bullying towards LGBTIQ children and teens in schools and communities. For helping us break through the heterosexism, racism, sexism, homo-hatred, and transphobia in ourselves, in our families and friends, in our communities and cultures. For honoring the dignity and worth of each person, for inspiring us with dreams and holy impatience, for challenging us to believe out loud. Loving God of many names, thank you for creating LGBTIQ people and our friends. Holy Creator, breathe new energies of kindness and love in the world. Wondrous wisdom, renew our commitment to work for justice for all. Amen.
If you'd join me in our closing hymn, In the Midst of New Dimensions.
In the midst of new dimensions, in the face of changing ways, who will lead the pilgrim people who wander in their separate ways? God of rainbow, fiery pillar, leading where the eagles soar, we, your people, ours the journey, now and ever, now and ever, now and evermore. As we stand, a world divided by our own self-seeking schemes, grant that we, your global village, might envision wider dreams. God of rainbow, fiery pillar, leading where the eagles soar, we, your people, ours the journey, now and ever, now and ever, now and evermore. We are man and we are woman, all persuasions old and young, each a gift in your creation, each a love song to be sung. God of rainbow, fiery pillar, lead us where the eagles soar. We, your people, ours the journey, now and ever, now and ever, now and evermore.
Yeah. I turned the air on.